Welcome to Just One Q, the podcast where we explore the latest ideas in workplace diversity, equity, and inclusion in conversation with thought leaders and DEI experts. Each episode, I ask our guest just one question, highlighting their area of expertise in DEI. The goal is to leave you with the tools and insights that you need to drive change in your own life, both personally and professionally. I'm your host, Dominique. I'm a diversity, equity, and inclusion educator and advocate working for the DEI and e-learning consultancy Dialectic in Guelph, Ontario. On this week's episode, I am joined by Dr. Suzanne Wertheim. After getting her PhD in linguistics from Berkeley, Suzanne held faculty positions at Northwestern, University of Maryland, and UCLA. In 2011, she left the university system in order to apply her expertise to real-world problems. Using the tools of linguistics anthropology, she guides clients to more inclusive language, content, and workplaces. Dr. Wertheim's new book, The Inclusive Language Field Guide, is now available everywhere books are sold. Hello, Dr. Wertheim. It's an absolute pleasure to have you on the show today.
Hello, Dominique. It is a pleasure to be here. And I think we forgot to mention this, but I love being introduced as Dr. Wertheim. And then as you and I talk collegially, I love to be called Suzanne.
I will refer to you as Suzanne from now on, but thank you so much for being here, Suzanne. It's a pleasure to have you. And the question that we're going to explore together today is very general, and it is, how can we learn to use inclusive language at work? And this is a broad question, but I think I don't want our listeners to be put off. We are going to get some nuanced answers in this episode, and we're going to dive a little bit deeper than just kind of that broad question. It is such an important question, though, not just for DEI professionals, but for absolutely everyone. And I dare say in every interaction, in every sphere of life. Language is such a big part of how we collectively make meaning. And of course, words have the power to make people feel included or excluded or even discriminated against in the workplace and in broader society. So inclusive language is, however, sometimes a bit of a contentious topic. And I'd say that it is so on all ends of the political spectrum. So I want to ask first, why is language the lever of choice for you in your DEI work?
I think this is one of the easiest questions I've been asked because it's my specialization, right? So I'm not one of those people. I do a lot of different things in my consulting work in the DEI space, but I've increasingly narrowed down to language because it's my favorite thing. But it's also what I have the deepest expertise in. And there are few to no other linguistic anthropologists in the DEI space in the US. I think some people are starting, but my area of study is language. So that is my tool. I'm a linguist. I'm a linguistic anthropologist. Inclusive language under different names and different rubrics is something I've been studying and educating about one way or another for more than 2 decades. So someone asked me recently, how long have you been looking at this? And I thought through, and I'm like, well, really, when I was TAing up the road as a wee little grad student, and I was explaining gender bias and racial bias in language, I'm like, so really, we can go back more than 2 decades for that.
Yeah, absolutely.
And because my field, in particular linguistic anthropology and linguistics, has done the worst job of PR over the centuries. So I think about, like, if it's the 1600s, popular understandings of astronomy or of anatomy are very different from today, but popular understandings of language are the same because we have not gotten our message out there. So let me, if you don't mind, take a minute and just explain, what do I do as a linguistic anthropologist? So in particular, we are experts at finding and identifying and naming patterns. So we dig into language, we dig into human interactions, and we dig up these patterns that people didn't know were there, but kind of feel them. And so when I point something out and I'm like, there's a name for this, here's how to delineate it, here's how it shows up, people are like, oh, I never put it together, but now that you say it, it's very coherent. And in particular, linguistic anthropologists, I mean, the study of human interactions and language is as broad as human people and language, right? But for me, I've been looking at, for decades again, the intersection of language, identity, and power. So I actually backed into this accidentally. I started very much focused on grammar and grammatical change. And then it turned out the only way to answer the questions I was interested in for my dissertation about what happens when one language is in contact with another, the only way to figure it out was by looking at how someone thought about themselves, how they thought about the person they were talking to, who they thought the more general audience was, what were the power dynamics in a given interaction, how did they slot into the given power dynamics for society as a whole. And it was so complicated that I ended up having to teach myself a whole new subfield, which is linguistic anthropology. So I think sometimes these kinds of questions sound very academic, and they are academic. Like I've literally taught thousands of college students how to run these kinds of analyses. But in my experience, language is this incredibly useful lens to tease out these small moments when inequity and exclusion are being enacted. Because we think a lot, especially in DEI or whatever you're calling it at your organization, we think a lot about systems, what's going on with the system. And what we like to do in my field, and what I like to do in particular, is look at those specific moments that accrete and add up and are the way that the system replicates itself and then possibly create bias interrupters to stop things from going off track the next time.
Amazing. I love that connection between language and power, and that it's basically impossible to understand linguistic patterns without sort of that broader context. And I also like that you've brought up the idea of language as both enacting bias or power dynamics and also being a tool for interrupting them. So you've kind of given us like a really amazing synopsis of why language is important. Can I ask you as a follow-up to that, what it is that you thought your book should address in terms of the gap or the thing that people really needed to know about language, and why you chose to write it and why you decided to put the content in it that you've selected?
One reason is that people ask me to write it, right? And for any people who are thinking about writing books out there, don't write more than 3 chapters as sample chapters, but do a nice full outline, because I had this idea. So when I sat down to outline my book, which took a full week, I had to take myself far away and have really only me, a cabin, I mean, literally a cabin, my computer, a bunch of index cards. But I sat with things that had been brought to me by people who hired me to do inclusive language workshops or to fix other things, people who are heads of HR departments or were high up in talent acquisition or were in DEI. Those were the main 3 groups of people who were bringing me in. But also I was looking at the data, which is very dense, from so many employee experience interviews that I had run, where I would ask very granular questions. I would never say bias. I would never say inequity. I would never say diversity. I would go one level down and say things like, can you remember a time at work that you felt like someone treated you as lower than your actual position? Can you remember a time at work that you felt like someone was treating you as more marginal or even outside when you were actually central or inside? And the stories come pouring out. So I sat there and I was like, what needs to be addressed? I reverse engineer every workshop is reverse engineered for a problem either I found or a problem people have said, this is such a painful problem, I'm willing to pay you to come in and help me fix it, right? And so this is why, to bring it back, so I came up with a book that had 29 chapters and was basically a year-long course, right? So what can you do if I can't be there? Because it makes so much sense. It's like karaoke, right? Like I'm talking, there's a workshop, people are like, oh, sure. And then when the words disappear and it's time for you to sing it on your own, they're like, oh, no, I can't do, like, I don't know the words. I can't do this, right? So I realized there had to be the words left behind, and that was going to have to be a book. So my acquisitions editor, who took me in right away, some people have to rewrite their proposals a lot. And he was like, no, we want this book. People will not read a book that's more than 10 chapters. I was like, but they're internet speed. He's like, no, your table of contents has to look like this, blah, blah, blah. You have to think about what you can cut out. You can't have this many words. We need to have it be 50,000 words. So I killed myself writing 50,000 words.
Sure.
And then they were like, oh, but what if we expanded? So it came in good enough quality. Like, in fact, I sent it to them at 55K, and it was like sweat and tears, no blood, just sweat and tears. Good and I said to them, I have it as low as I can. It, like, if you need more cut out, you have to tell me. But it was really good. And sometimes I don't miss at all what didn't go in. It's hard for me to remember what I thought was so important, because I think that a book and a workshop language is so huge and people get so overwhelmed or confused or nervous, and there are so many kinds of people and there's so many different words. I thought, how can I streamline this so you can read it in just a few hours and be like, okay, I get the big picture. And then it's secretly a 6-month course. If you can't have me in there for 6 months, which I don't want to be there for 6 months, there's activities at the end of each of 6 chapters that you can practice for a month at a time, because you need to acquire inclusive language skills the way you acquire foreign language skills, with a little bit of practice and understanding you're probably going to make mistakes and having someone who can correct you on those mistakes.
I love that. I love that the book comes with practice and that you've recognized that workshops have so much potential, but then there's like the experience and the things that can live in your mind immediately, but then there's like the things that need to live in the world a little bit. And like, I think that your book is one of those things, right? You've created basically a magical job aid that people can just take home from a workshop, for example, and dive deeper into it, give themselves the time and space to really process all of the information and then have that practice. And the beautiful thing is that you can practice these things independently before you ever have to go out into the world and practice them. So it's like it creates this beautiful, private, shame-free experience where people can practice and then test out their skills and have that safety in doing it. That's a really powerful thing about your book. Another thing that struck me about your book is really the approach that you used in how you structured your book, and that it's not according to specific rules or identities, even like a lot of other language pointers are structured according to, like, for example, race as a category or gender. And then it's like bulleted by, how specific terminology regarding certain identities. But you structured your book according to behavioral principles. And I just want to ask you a little bit about why you chose that frame.
It's one of the first things we talked about when we were getting to know each other before the podcast.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just so happy that you're talking about this, because it really is, I think, the main differentiator of my book from other inclusive language resources out there. Again, I'm the only person coming from my specific field of linguistic anthropology and who's written a book on this subject. There were a few reasons why I felt like the identity-based approach didn't work that well. And because we talked about this before, I was able to really cohere them, because I think they were a little, they weren't super explicit. Like, it's that thing where it's like, I know it's the right thing to do, but can I talk about it? Actually, this is what the principles are good for too, which I'll get to that in a minute. So very honestly, I told you a minute ago that I reverse engineer all my workshops to solve problems that my clients bring me. Well, one of the problems is that I have global clients. And a lot of DEI stuff, you're sitting in Canada, a lot of DEI stuff comes out of the US and treats the US as if it's everywhere, treats American categories as if they are universally applicable, treats English categories as if they are universally applicable. And to me, this is a big failure. So I have clients who are like, well, but in the Netherlands, they're like, well, we don't talk about race. And I'm like, sure, because you've got the Turkish guest workers, and it's really about ethnicity and language. And people in India are like, well, we're not talking about race. I'm like, no, because there's colorism and there's caste, right? So what I needed something that was more generally applicable. It's great to write about the history of the African diaspora and the many horrible ways that people have been treated and the words that aren't good because of that history. But what good does that do for people where that history isn't relevant, right? So that was the first reason, very practical. Another practical reason, and I imagine that this is something that you've seen a lot as a practitioner, we're both in the trenches. We both, before the pandemic, I could read body language, right? I'm always adjusting to reading who's saying what. And this is how I started in the first place, because I would present as a wee little teaching assistant up the road from where I'm sitting at UC Berkeley. I would present science and be like, here's a peer-reviewed article on gender bias. Here's a peer-reviewed article on racial bias and how it shows up in language. And I would see body resistance, body language of resistance, and then sometimes verbal resistance I would encounter from my undergrads. And I'd be like, but why? This is just science. And so I started way back then, how can we bypass things so people can do a shift in vision without the resistance that's blocking them for some reason. And so one area of resistance I find a lot is an empathy deficit, where I see this as related to a data deficit. So people like me your audience can't see me, but I'll tell them, and I'll tell them in the book too, that I am technically white, but I'm an ethnic minority. I have dark brown hair. I have tan skin. I have dark eyes. Since the incubator, people have assumed that I am Puerto Rican on the East Coast of New York, the East Coast of the US, and have assumed that I'm Mexican or Central American. And all my time on the West Coast, people assume that I have a list of literally 115 things people have thought I am that I'm not,
Right.
because it's so funny. Right. So,
that's a fun little list to keep.
yeah, it is. And I have friends who call me Pangea. One friend saw me called 5 different names on one street and spoken to in 5 different languages on one street in Chicago, which is known for a lot of different immigrant restaurants and stores. And we kept track, and he's like, you're like the original continent. So there's literally people who call me Pangea because of that. So I have a lot of data that my brain has been able to process through pattern recognition to tell me that bias is real. So it takes a long time. And for a lot of us who are the recipients of bias, gender bias, what other kinds of bias, we often think that the problem is us, and we internalize. And it can take a long time to realize, like, oh, no, it's not something I'm doing wrong. This is just out there in the world. Well, a lot of people have a data deficit. If you belong to many or all, especially visible dominant group categories, you haven't had the luxury of all the bias data that's been thrown at someone like me, or people who are more perceptibly biased, more perceptively different, not belonging to dominant group categories than I am, right? So people who have a data deficit often have an empathy deficit because it doesn't feel real. And so there's nothing for them to latch onto it. So it feels like people talking about BS or making stuff up or being oversensitive.
Yeah.
And since 2020 here in the US, we had so much stuff going on after the extrajudicial murder of George Floyd by American police. And I looked and I'm like, oh, there are people in this country, a lot of people who are probably sitting in my workshops who literally don't care if a Black person is shot to death by cops, or literally don't care about the life and death situation of refugees coming from Mexico and from Central America, often because of American interventions, right? Mm-hmm. So it's like we're originally responsible for it too. So I'm like, if people don't care if other people who don't look like them live or die, am I going to come from an identity perspective and say, hey, here's this group of people that's been treated badly. Stop saying articulate to Black people. Like, that's how non-convincing is that going to be? And then it's also, I've learned that a positive framing, I co-facilitate things sometimes with change management people. I'm not a change management expert, even though I've tried to do it in my book, but I try to learn a lot from my colleagues, and positive framings and aspirational behavior and things that are external to you. So with unconscious bias, I feel like we throw people in a pit. We're like, your brain is biased. You're a bad person. Best of luck to you. Like, nothing you can do is going to change your brain, right? Like, best of luck. I feel like a lot of people feel like they're in a pit, and a lot of white men come into my workshops feeling like they're going to be attacked. Mm-hmm. And a brownish lady is going to lecture them for an hour or two, and then 10 minutes in, I can see them relaxing because I'm like, here's the science. 100% of human beings are biased. It's not your fault. You've got cultural programming that set up mental models that distort the world. Let's figure out how to get you better data. Let's figure out how to interrupt the bias that you're saying by choosing these words instead of those words. And they're like, oh, that's it. And so I used to have, here's a way that my editor also helped me. So you don't have an 80,000 word, 29 chapter book. If you choose to buy my book, it's much more streamlined and it's very readable. But you also don't have a set of principles that are framed negatively, because that is a fallout that came from people are coming to me and saying, here are these problems. And so I framed everything as, how do you fix the problem? Stop doing this bad thing. So all my principles were framed very negatively. And one of my editors said to me, hey, we've learned that people prefer to have these framed positively. And I was like, oh my God, this is so obvious. Like years and years I've been doing this, and it could have landed so much better.
Absolutely.
So positive aspirational framing, behavior that's external to you, and understanding that this is something you were trained to do. And for every behavior shift, you want to shift the food you eat, you want to shift how you exercise, you want to shift your posture. Actually, that's one I'd love to learn. all of these things, we all know that you have to recognize when you're doing the thing you don't want to do. And then what's the small change you can do? And then how do you practice to make this the habit? So when you go on autopilot, and most of our language is produced on autopilot, we're so busy thinking about, unless we have the luxury of a teleprompter, right? We're so busy thinking about what we want to get across that we often lose track of how we're phrasing it. And this is, again, how these problematic words and phrases and framings come across and create harm out in the world.
I love that. Like, you've given me a massive answer, but the thing that I'm hearing back is, first of all, it's approachable, right? And what you've done with the framing in terms of coming from behavioral principles that are kind of a positive frame is that it makes the book accessible to people who might otherwise feel chastised, who might otherwise feel defensive, who might otherwise feel like, or hopeless in their patterns. And this is like, instead of just a list of do's and don'ts, you're giving them sort of the antidote to the bigger problem. And so that they are internalizing this new frame of reference, and then their language comes out kind of more naturally and not as a forced recollection in the moment. Am I understanding that right?
And I would add to, yes, always. Anything I ever say, you're always completely understanding it and then adding to it. So thank you for that. I would add to that, again, how can the book be a little me and helpful in the places where I can't be? How can I distribute my expertise and knowledge and make people feel better? How can I give people that end of the workshop feeling, oh, I'm going to go out in the world and do better? And then the reality sinks in 2 weeks later, wait, what was I supposed to do?
Yeah.
So the set of 6 principles is also a set of guidelines that people can use on their own, because sometimes people feel like they can't have a conversation and they don't have expertise, but people have expertise of their community, their community norms, how things are done. And what I'm saying is add on top of that community expertise, my expertise, and go through my 6 principles as guardrails for the conversation. So you can figure out, is this thing genuinely problematic, or is it something that's okay? And it's, I call it like show your work, right?
Yeah.
If you can explain, well, I'm using this word. Okay, for example, people sometimes reach out to me with 2 examples. I was brought in for an inclusive language workshop for a nonprofit that works with a lot of marginalized communities about a natural disaster thing. I don't like to give away clients, right?
Sure.
I don't think they would mind. But so there's a natural disaster thing. And of course, natural disasters affect the people living in the worst neighborhoods, and so they have to find them. So they were talking about, they're trying to be very, very careful with their language. And they do a lot of partnering with Native American communities here in the US. And so they kept on asking me to make a decision. Should we say this word or that word? And I said, but I can't tell you because I am neither in your community nor in the affected community. So what I'm going to say to you is take my 6 principles and use them for a discussion in a town hall and get a consensus from people. You can use this to guide a discussion, right? And
Amazing.
so the other way is also sometimes people will hypercorrect and say that there are things you shouldn't say. We can leave that till later, but I'll just leave that there. People will overextend rules and call out language that I don't think is problematic. And so you can use these principles and say at the end, well, I don't think this term that you're saying is problematic. It doesn't seem to fit the definition of problematic language because it doesn't violate these 6 principles of inclusive language, which cover literally everything. Like it's all the language. So if it doesn't violate them, then I think it's okay. And I think you can rest on it and feel confident moving forward. So everything is designed to help people talk amongst themselves and then feel confident moving forward, or learn how to adjust by using principles rather than this list of do's and don'ts, which changes within 2 seconds.
Yeah. So. No, that's amazing. And I think like my next question sort of ties into this idea, I think, and that is DEI practitioners and the people who are routinely engaging in DEI type work. It doesn't have to be DEI specifically, but facilitators and policy writers and people who are working in spaces where language really matters are generally pretty attuned and pretty good at knowing and what terms to use, which ones to avoid. We have a running list, like we're just engaged in that space a lot. So what can somebody like that gain from reading this book? And I've heard you kind of partially answer that question already, but maybe if you could expand on that a tiny bit.
Sure. So back to writing the book. They tell you your book isn't for everybody. You can't write your book for everybody, and you can't sell your book to everybody. You have to focus on 3 kinds of reader. And so when I was thinking about my book, I thought about how to on-ramp somebody who's coming from a place where they really want to learn, but they don't have the knowledge set. Someone coming from the place where they're skeptical, but someone's like, you really need to know this. And coming from a place where they already know it. And so, to my mind, it was people like DEI practitioners or really up to speed HR practitioners or Gen Z people coming in who are kind of native speakers of a lot of inclusive language, who natively understand, for example, that gender isn't binary, which is what I was taught in school and internalized. And it's been a big paradigm shift for me over the years, and things still slip out because they're so habitual, right?
Yeah.
So what's very nice about the principles is they let people explain. So you can be super up to speed, but just because you're a native speaker of a language doesn't mean you can explain the principles of that language to other people. As someone who has learned languages from people who are native speakers and have been trained in how to explain grammar, and from native speakers who are just kind of winging it, let me tell you that people who can explain the principles are much, much better teachers. And so this is the same way. If I have found it works for people, then I'm giving you my most effective toolkit for you to use in your explanations to other people, right?
Brilliant.
So that's the first reason. The second reason is that because I'm coming again from a science perspective, and because I'm coming from the study of contextualized language use and human behavior, I've got some concepts in there for things that people, I think a lot of them are things people are recognizing, but I'm giving names and explanations so you can start calling them out in your own practice. So linguistic distortions like masking language, when people are like, we should keep it neutral, or that's just PC, I'm like, I have an explanation for that.
Right.
Or when people say and do problematic things and it's poo-pooed, oh, he's a really good guy, or you shouldn't take it personally, or aren't you being oversensitive, right? I've got an answer for that. That's called softening language. Or inflating language, when people talking about bias have got basically whistleblower retaliation and are talked about as if they are the problem and as if their behavior is inappropriate. So by having terminology like that, I'm giving additional tools to people, because sometimes it's so frustrating. You see it and you're like, oh, how can I explain it? Especially like you don't have an hour to explain it. You've got like 5 minutes. So that's the other reason I've seeded it with these kinds of explanations that I think will land more strongly on practitioners than on the general public.
That's a beautiful explanation for why DEI practitioners can use this book. And I would have loved to give that answer myself as someone who's read your book and benefited from it, but I'm so glad to have those reasons articulated. And my next question is about some of the controversy. So I want to touch on this. Maybe you can decide where you want to take it, but some linguists and political commentators have sort of espoused a perspective that most of the inclusive lexicon is kind of elitist, or that people tend to prioritize political correctness or linguistic correctness over connection. How can your book help guide us through our responses here?
So this is something I don't think about that much, honestly. And you when we talked about this earlier, you even mentioned a linguist who I know since my first year of grad school. And I'm like, yeah, I'm not even going to read his book because I don't have the time and energy. But on the other hand, so I'm not going to directly address specific complaints from specific people. And when people come to me and they say, you must explain the value of inclusive language, I put it right up front. I'm like, every single thing you say and do affects your relationships with other people, is a thing I say in the book and I say in my workshops. I'm like, inclusive language bolsters your relationships. People feel seen, heard, valued, taken into consideration. You amplify your relationships. And this is all kinds of relationships between your marketing text, between your company and your possible consumer, sales rep and prospect, coworkers, manager and report. It's in a business context. It's not just. So first of all, my book is 100% about how do we make our relationships as good as possible. And problematic language does the reverse. Part of the thing that they're not talking about is, well, what happens when you say problematic things that land badly? And those things may or may not be words that are discussed out in the world by people, right? So I'm, again, allowing people to define their own problematic language and to define their own terms, right?
Right.
So problematic language, I mean, I just have a gigantic examples database filled with examples of people who quit companies, who drop relationships, who withdraw their candidacy. They're recruited. They're a high-level person being recruited. And they're like, oh, you're going to misgender me? This is when you're supposed to be behaving your best. How can I
Mm.
work for a company if I'm going to be like, it's very irritating and sometimes painful to be misgendered. Like, if you can't treat me with that modicum of respect, why would I even bother working there? And then also people are ghosting. Nobody's going to educate you. I'm collecting right now all of these stories of sales calls gone wrong. And I'm going to start going on sales podcasts and being like, do you want to know the 6 words that account for $20 million of lost revenue, according to my
Yeah.
examples database? Right. So like money talk. So I'm like, hey, here's one reason to use inclusive language. Like maybe don't. But I think what's at the heart of this is this issue of power marginalization, power dynamics all over again. And so why is some language problematic language? It's because the 21st century etiquette that we're moving towards is the same as earlier etiquette, right? Be polite, be warm, be respectful, take people into account. The only difference is now we're being told, take into account people that it was okay to ignore or step on or say bad things about earlier. That's the only difference, is that the principles of etiquette are the same. We're just expanding who gets to be listened to and say, oh, actually, I don't like that. Like, you think that's okay. So there's always the stigma that comes from being part of a devalued, marginalized, oppressed in some cases community. And one thing that happens is those kinds of people have been muted historically. And even now, there's all kinds of fun research. I didn't expect to talk about this, but there's research that shows that you can prime people in as little as 10 minutes to be less empathetic. And when you are higher ranked, you don't hear people speaking indirectly, right?
Mm.
So, and there's amazing black box data from plane crashes that show that a co-pilot is trying to indirectly bring attention to their higher ranked pilot, the captain, trying to bring attention, but they're so indirect. And you literally, it's harder to hear indirect speech when you're higher ranked, but you're locked into indirect speech when you're lower ranked, right? So there are all of these problems where people have been trying to tell us stuff and we haven't heard it. And maybe we still don't hear it. When I run inclusive leadership workshops for my executives, I'm like, you've got a real problem because your nervous system has changed and you literally can't hear when people are trying to run a course correction on you. I'm like, so let's try to figure out how to make that happen. So I think that one of the elitist things that happens is that people who go into DEI is currently in the US, and I'm not sure about Canada, but currently white dominated at the highest levels.
Yep.
Yeah. So white dominated at the highest levels, and there are all the reasons why, and it's mostly white women. And so there are reasons why, and they include access to white men. And if you're only one off from the dominant group, it's easier to put you in a position of power. I think of like Tim Cook from Apple is one off because he's gay. Barack Obama is one off because he's half Black, right? But otherwise white, male, cishet, Christian, right? You know, like all of the things. So if you're only one off, it makes it easier. So it makes sense that people with power, when they're granting power to other people, are like, oh, you're only one off. Okay, like you make sense to me. You can come in. So there's this problem when people who are out group tell people who are in group how things are supposed to be for them. And so, in fact, I pulled up because I was pretty sure we we're going to talk about this. The problem with some inclusive language is it acquires the flavor, the taste, the social context, the way the word feels to you. That's beyond the dictionary. This flavor of a well-intentioned white lady lecturing me on something she doesn't know anything about becomes the flavor of some of these words. Actually, a lot of these words have in-group origins, right? And so when I shift my language, I'm always following in-group activists because for me, they're the people who have both the lived experience and have been thinking through the things. You can't just have an in-group person because a lot of men write to me angrily and say, it's Latino and Latinos. And that represents everybody. And I'm like,
Right.
I've got a pile of data that shows that's not true. Like I can run semantic tests that show that Latino is a male specific word and it represents specifically men. It creates mental models that are male specific, right? But so the thing spelled Latin X that was originally meant to be pronounced Latina with the gender neutral letter E pronounced X. So anarchists like the X because X is kind of anarchic and whatever. So you've got Uruguayan and Argentinian and Spanish anarchists writing the letter X that's meant to be pronounced E. And then there's uptake, but then people are angry and they're like, oh, it's just well-intentioned white people telling me what to do. And I'm like, actually, it's super anarchic young people several decades ago, right? So my clients sometimes especially when there's a large group of people and you're trying to use an ethnonym or some other group label, and people within the group have different opinions. I mean, my answer is you maybe shouldn't be using only one term to refer to the group. Like, how do you justify and show I've thought about it? I've talked to these people. And so, like my clients, I've got a financial services client that has me on monthly retainer, and they always have interesting questions. And they're like, what do we do? And I'm like, I think you can't. They're like, you switched to Latina written with an E recently. What do I do? And I'm like, but my brand is inclusion. People expect me to do the cutting edge thing. I'm not saying stodgy, but I'm like, you're, financial services. I'm like, so I'm going to say, do one behind and spell it with an X. I'm like, and then I would like hyperlink or put an asterisk and put an explanation and say, we know that for some people who belong to this group, this term doesn't feel like it represents them, but we are following in-group activists, or, we're doing this specifically, but we also are including people who think of themselves as Hispanic or Latina or Latino. So I think that sometimes we just have to say more things to show that we're actually trying to follow and amplify the voices of these stigmatized people. Why did people say Latinx? Because they were non-binary or they were feminist. Like for them, it was all Spanish speakers, right? It wasn't like, we need white people in the US to think of us this way. This was an in-group thing. We're all Spanish speakers. And then the out-group was people who weren't represented by the letter O, meaning masculine.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing is like, it's not an elitist construct. It's actually just people trying to amplify the voices of people who are sometimes silenced or marginalized by using the terms that they prefer. But when those terms encounter then other groups who may have different terms, context matters. And it's important to then shift or explain or kind of put that asterisk on our speech and say, this is where I'm getting this. This is where it comes from. And to justify it to people who have questions about it. And then to use a language that they also prefer if you're referring to them as a way of respect. It sounds like a very intuitive kind of thing. And I can think of examples in my work too, where that happens to me, where as the white lady facilitator or the white lady DEI person, I come in and I'll talk about like anti-fat bias or anti-fatness. And they're like, wow, you're saying the word fat. And I'm like, well, this is what activists are saying to say. And it's not me, it's these people. And I can point to specific articles or specific groups who are, don't want to talk about overweight or whatever, because there are problems with how that's constructed in their minds. And so it's interesting. It puts you in awkward situations sometimes where you're dealing with people who have a certain identity and you don't, you're like kind of external to it. And yet you're having to justify the use of terms that maybe they aren't their favorite or they're not aware of that activism. So I can understand those examples. And I think they're also rare. They do happen, but it's certainly not, to my mind, this argument of elitism is a little bit far-fetched. I think if you adopt, again, those principles that you're talking about, they're navigable. Like it's not going to be the end of inclusive language when you encounter these situations. You just have to find what inclusive means in that particular moment.
And I think it's okay to talk explicitly about leveraging your power to amplify. I mean, so that's the thing, is sort of like, I have a colleague who is really good. He's a white man, and his awakening came when he was younger, and his father came out and then ended up dying of AIDS, right? So a whole new world opened to him. And then he spent a lot of his life after that interrogating his racial biases, right? And so he's written a nice book. And he has turned off his comments on LinkedIn because people will say to him, gatekeeping from the left, where do you get off being a white man in DEI work, right? Like, how do you do this? You're taking the space that rightfully belongs to, for example, a woman of color. But my feeling is that we have to use whatever standing we have, whatever power we have, it's our responsibility to use it to leverage. And sometimes people need the white person to tell them first. And then they're open to rethinking their biased attitudes towards the Black woman who's coming next. Like sometimes you just can't lead. It's awful. It's awful. But I am being as pragmatic and practical as possible. If there are people who are skeptical, sometimes you can't start them on level 3. And level 3 might be a Black woman coming in and talking about privilege. I don't even talk about privilege anymore with intro level people because I found that people don't get it. I have to go so granular. I talk about the building blocks of privilege, but I found that there's some things that you just have to lead up to for people who are just starting. If you try to get them way up to speed, it doesn't work. And again, this is the reason why thinking about language, in my book, I talk a few times about stigma and how devalued some identities are. And in fact, let me just have a quote that I think helps us articulate as DEI practitioners, how can we move forward? And so Emily Ladeau is a wheelchair user who's written a short, very concise, pleasant book on talking with and about disabled people. And so she used to be very firmly, so here in the US, is it people with disabilities or is it disabled people? I was listening to a podcast recently with a linguist who's now a researcher on disability in the UK, and it's exactly opposite, right? So they have things that go to both audiences, and so they're stuck in this position. But what she talks about in her book is how much people disrespected her own choices. So here's the quote that I like, because I think it really summons up why those of us who come from a power place, it's our job to change the minds, right? So she said, I was tired of mostly non-disabled people telling me that person first language was right and identity first language was wrong. I was tired of calling myself disabled and being told, oh, you shouldn't talk about yourself like that, or I don't even think of you as disabled. So I write, you can feel that lingering stigma around disability. You shouldn't talk about yourself like that can be translated as, don't describe yourself using insulting and negative language. I don't even think of you as a certain identity shows the negative flavor of that identity. And in my experience with Black friends and Black colleagues, it's the same thing where people will say, as a compliment, and I am air quoting for those of you listening, compliment, I don't even think of you as Black, right? It's not a compliment. So what I'm saying is, if a disabled person is saying, here's my terminology of choice, and then a well-meaning out-group person says to them, oh, no, you shouldn't use that word. This is problematic gatekeeping. And I see that as violating my principles of inclusive language, right? So it's violating show respect, it's violating draw people in, it's violating incorporate other perspectives, right? So that's why I'm saying you can use my principles to avoid those things. You can call that out and say, you're actually, with this correction, you're actually violating the principles. And if a person is doing reclamation work and saying, here's a term that has some stigma, but I'm going to use it proudly because I like how it reflects my identity, right? So we've seen that with queer, made it mainstream, even though a lot of older people have so many negative associations that they can't use it. So even a lot of terminology for LGBTQ plus, I've heard people on podcasts who are pioneers in being out and lesbian in very loud and very masculine ways, right? Make fun of the acronym. And they're like, oh, the kids these days and this ridiculous. So you can be in group and still disparaging preferred terminology for people. So these are things that we have to navigate case by case. But I guess the biggest thing is if somebody says, I like this word, I'm part of a stigmatized group and I like this word and I want to use it to describe myself, you can say, it makes me uncomfortable. I don't know that I'm licensed to use it, but I respect your right to use it. And if I'm writing a profile of somebody, I can say who refers to herself as a dyke, who, members of the quote unquote dyke community, as they prefer to be called, right? So I'm not claiming institutional license to use it myself, but I am respecting the choices of people who are pulling that language and using it for their own purposes.
Absolutely. And just acknowledging that positionality and the power and who you are in relation to that community and the context and all of that nuance is so important. And it's work that's worth doing. And I think all of these examples point to a commitment and just this attitude of basically engagement and choosing not to be lazy in our use of words, bothering to honor people in our speech, and just coming at it with this attitude of a bit of humility and the willingness to explain when there is a disagreement or when we have a different perspective. So I want to kind of close with this last question. And I mean, I have a couple of little questions to settle afterward, but this is a big one for me. And I think interpersonal benefits of inclusive communication are pretty obvious, right? When I honor somebody with my words, we're going to get along better and we're going to feel better in our relationship. But when I think about the role of language in society, I can really easily conjure negative examples of words that are used as weapons. And jokingly, I'll say like, thanks to Chomsky, because I feel like, as a student, this is how we're trained. Like we critically analyze text. We find the perversions. We find like how words are weaponized. We find, the dog whistles and all of the terms that are in there that are misused or misappropriated. But I'm going to turn to you and just ask you if you have any contemporary examples to share about the role of language in positive social change. I just feel like I want to give you a minute to just wow us with what the power of language is and how it can actually be part of social movements and really bring people together instead of divide, as we sometimes see it do.
I don't know that I'm going to focus on bringing together, because for me, when I connect positive language use and social change, here's coming from my perspective again as a linguist. I like it when people come up with new words or phrases that do some linguistic work for us and force us to rethink our mental models and unearth patterns that maybe we didn't see before and say, hey, this is what your language is doing when it's out in the world. Right. Use this term instead, because I think you might not want to do that. So my three examples for this, and they're all gender related, are Ms., the honorific Ms., the honorific mix or mux, depending on how you say it, MX, and the phrase slut shaming. Because I think all three of these do really, really good work and really are one less spread out in the lexicon. But I just had a book event promoting my book. As we're recording this, my book was just released. And next week, from where I'm sitting, the bookstore that hosted me is hosting a 50-year retrospective of Ms. Magazine. So that's how long Ms. has been out in the world.
Yeah.
So what does Ms. do? I actually talk about this in the book, because people who want to be polite then are faced with the like, how do I be polite if I want to address people politely using an honorific? And an honorific is either usually before or after a name, depending on your language, Japanese, Korean after a name, English, French, German before a name, a little tiny word or word part that says, I'm speaking to you respectfully. So for a very long time in English, anyone old enough was called Mr., who seemed to be male. Mr. this, Mr. that. So you only needed to know one thing. That's a male person. But for respectfully addressing a female person who was old enough, right? So let's just say 18 and up, you had to know their marital status too. So it was a 2-point assessment, gender and marital status, married Mrs., unmarried Miss. And so the people who came up with Ms. said, no, why are we always assessing marital status only for one kind of person? Either assess it for everybody or assess it for nobody. And guess what? We don't want it assessed. So they came up with this term Ms. that is agnostic for marital status. P.S. I used to, when I was still teaching undergrads, I used to poll them on their use, and marital status came back in, because the cultural attitudes towards assessing the sexual availability of women are so strong that they would come back in and they'd be like, Mrs. if you know, Miss if they're young, and Ms. if you don't know. Like, so they still had, they'd moved into a 3-part thing, but marital status was still on the table. So the next one is much newer, and that's MX, pronounced by some people mix, pronounced by some people mux. Just want to check and see if somebody's using it how they prefer. And so they go one step further and say, all right, it used to be for women, for gender, like you're assessing gender and marital status. Well, what if gender isn't relevant to politeness? What if you just say this? And so I, for example, will often use doctor and my initial, so people don't know what my gender is, Dr. S. Wertheim, right? So because I like to gender neutralize my stuff. And so it's the same thing with MOOCs. They're like, so I like this idea where people just saying, here's this new word. Well, why are we thinking about gender? My gender. So either it's for people who are non-binary or for people who want to degender. So it's both ways. And then I really like slut shaming, which really is showing up a lot in popular media, et cetera, which shuts down this, again, constant, ongoing rape culture assessment of the sexual availability of and the sexual activity of only female people. I used to run exercises with data gathering of my students who thought they were so feminist. And then they would do some stuff and I'd be like, all right, give me all the words you collected. They were collecting for slang. And I'm like, all right, give me all the words you collected in the last week for a sexually available or sexually active woman, positive ones and negative. And this is a big class and they have to yell out terrible things that involve bucket or rag or so many things. I'm like, and for men, and what you end up with is we just compiled them. I just had an open sheet and I compiled them. And I'm like, you think you're so feminist. And in the last week, you have all done this. You have all been present in this long list of words penalizing women for being sexually active when there is no assessment of and no penalty for male people. This is at a time when we weren't talking that much about non-binary people.
Right.
So, and it wasn't going to be reflected in the language. And a lot of people who are non-binary weren't perceptibly non-binary. So I kept it binary for that. But so slut shaming out there does that quick thing where it's like, you're going to think something negative about this sexually active woman or about this woman who is wearing clothing that she wants to wear, and you're going to relate it to sexual availability or sexual activity. And I'm shutting that down up front. So those are my three. I don't know that they bring people together so much, but as they move into popular parlance, they affect changes in mental models and assessments that we make and ways that we categorize people. And that's what I'm doing with my book. And I love that people are out there doing it with their language every day in different ways. So I'm super happy about it.
I love these examples. And it's like, especially the Ms. one is very, because it's so old. I think that's amazing. Like, I think often people think of shifting language as really like a millennial or a Gen Z kind of phenomenon, that we're pushing this agenda and that we're like hyper political and that we're, it's like, it's gone too, this whole identity thing has gone too far. But it's like, no, this is ancient. Like, this goes way back and this change is constant, right? These social changes are always going to be with us. This is not a new problem or a new phenomenon. And I think that reminder is really wonderful. And you've given examples that really showcase how accepted this can become in our language and how widely used and how effortless also, right? Suzanne, I really appreciate the nuance that you've brought to this approach and the nuance of your work and your book. I want to ask you, where can listeners find your book or find out more about your work?
The easiest way is at SuzanneWertheim.com. Good luck spelling it, but it's out there. And presumably my name will be visible in whatever way that you're listening to this podcast. So
absolutely. Yep.
That's the easiest way, because I give you different ways to order it depending on your preference. Indie bookstore, Amazon, Penguin, all the places. So
yeah, and shout out to those indie bookstores. That's always the best way.
Always the best way.
Yeah, any listeners
always
out
the best
there,
way.
Always make the effort to go to the indie bookstores and order through them if you can. Suzanne, I have one last kind of bonus question. Is there any other person or organization's work that you want to amplify while you've got the listener's ear here?
I do. I'm so excited that you brought up anti-fatness, because that is a thing that is very under-discussed and is not legally protected where I'm sitting in the US, even though weight bias is measurable and bad. So I really like the work of Aubrey Gordon, who I've been following before she came out with her name, when she was just Your Fat Friend, writes fantastic short things and has good books also about anti-fatness. I really like Terry Givens, who is a political scientist who now is up in Canada at McGill. She's got a book on radical empathy. And I am a big fan of Sarah Ahmed, who does very, very rigorous work. And she's got a book on complaint that I think we all need to read, because it shows the mechanisms of how change and inequity and requests for things to be better are stymied by bureaucratic systems and by organizations. I think it's an academic-y book, but I think we can read it and be like, oh, that's where the problem is, especially for people who are in-house and are like, why are the wheels spinning and nothing is changing? This book really unearths those ways to give you at least better vision. I don't know. I mean, good luck.
Yeah.
Good luck. But yeah.
Well, amazing. Those are great recommendations. Thank you so much for sharing those with us. And Dr. Suzanne Wertheim, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been an absolute pleasure to speak with you.
It is a pleasure to speak with you. Thank you so much for the invitation.
As always, I want to welcome any of our listeners to reach out to me if you'd like to be featured as a guest on this podcast, or if you'd like to sneakily nominate someone. I take sneaky nominations. You can find my email in the show notes. And if you like what you're hearing, please leave us a rating and a review, or share this episode to your own socials. It truly does help get the podcast and its important message into more ears. I am Dominique. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you next time on Just One Q.